ترامب 2.0 من غرفة الأخبار. هاي المرة يأتيكم من منتدى قطر الاقتصادي، وهاي المرة راح يكون مع ضيفتي اللي بتطلع معي دايما على الشاشة، نينا ترنتمان. Hello Nina and welcome to Qatar. Welcome to the region.
Yeah.
Usually whenever we have an interview, you're in New York and I'm in Dubai.
And now we meet in real life.
We meet in Doha in real life. Nina, our podcast is about how the newsroom has changed recently, how there's always excitement whenever there's a new rule, a new law, everything comes out ever since President Trump took office. How has your work changed?
Yeah, it's a good question because, of course, in some ways a lot has changed, and in some ways also nothing has changed. Because, of course, we're still reporting the news, we're still very much trying to make sense of what the administration is doing and what Trump is doing, which is the tricky part. And so I think one of the things that I'm certainly trying to do, talking to CFOs, is get an understanding of how do they think about this, what are the things they're doing to try to understand what's currently going on. And of course, as you pointed out, it's basically every time you wake up in the morning there's new headlines. So of course there's a lot for us to report on, there's a lot of things to ask CFOs about. So from a news perspective, I think it's a super interesting time.
So when we say it's a super interesting time, has it changed? You said some things are changed, some things haven't changed. What hasn't changed? The news. But what has changed?
I think, of course, we're asking way more about the US, Trump, the implications, like prior to that. So I've been doing this newsletter for about a year, and last year the topics were really a bit different than this year. Like some of the things that we are now asking about, like for example, US dollar, US credit rating, tariffs, tensions.
So tariffs was not even an issue last year.
A lot of the things have actually changed quite a bit in terms of the news agenda that we're talking to CFOs about. And so also we are talking certainly more to US CFOs than we did last year, just because of course they're at the forefront of what is happening. They're basically at the forefront of having to respond to the tariffs and everything. So I think that certainly has changed. I think in other ways, like I'm still doing my job as I was doing it before, trying to be objective, speaking to people, trying to get a better understanding, doing a lot of interviews, so that has not changed.
So the key word here is trying. What about the CFOs themselves? Has anything changed for them? When you ask them, how do you feel they're reacting? Are they surprised? Are they overwhelmed? Because I tell you, in the newsroom, we are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Sometimes we are like, okay, we have to change everything. We have to change the whole bulletin. We have to change our whole show. What about the CFOs? Do you feel, when you speak to them, do you feel that they are also overwhelmed sometimes?
Yeah, specifically when you talk to them off the record or on background, then people really tell you that, like, I have no idea what's going on. Not all of them. Some of them, of course, are also saying, well,
they have a clear message.
Yeah, they have a clear path, or also because they might have a business that is just not very exposed to tariffs. Like some businesses basically sail along independent of what happens. Like if you're running a utility, for example, those CFOs are sort of saying, oh yeah, it's interesting, but it's not impacting me very much. And then you have those CFOs where basically with a whim, anything and everything might change independent of what they might have thought they were doing. Trump might just change everything and overnight. And so I think that is certainly interesting to get a sense from people. Well, how do you navigate this? What are the strategies that you're deploying? How can you plan for the future? How can you forecast as a CFO, given that many things are still changing, and I'm not sure if we're at the end of the volatility already. So I think that is certainly interesting to see. Even though coming here to the Middle East, I'm also surprised actually that there is a lot of optimism that came from CFOs. We just hosted a roundtable.
CFOs in the Middle East?
Yes, CFOs
Why
in
do
the
you
region.
think that is? Because of President Trump's visit, or is there?
Yeah, like there was one company that we spoke to that basically signed a big deal as part of Trump's visit here, and so they were saying, well, we're as optimistic as we can be. Then also there were others that were pointing out that they were seeing sort of growing economic growth in Saudi Arabia, so they were saying the consumer there in Saudi Arabia will pick up in terms of spending. So they were actually quite optimistic, which is interesting because coming from the US, speaking to US CFOs last week, it was very much like,
question mark. You did mention something I found interesting. Off the record, they tell you something. And of course, we know as journalists, there's no such thing as off the record. How comfortable are they today to speak off the record to you compared to before?
I would certainly say that there is a fair amount of caution around anything that they say. And certainly you notice that when you speak to people on background, or even when you talk to them off the record, that you still have this sense that people are pretty guarded.
Okay.
Which I think is also, of course, a function of PR people being pretty involved and trying to steer the conversation. There's still conversations that are pretty frank. So some CFOs that I speak with, when I speak to them off the record, they really tell you how things are.
Okay.
But then there's also others that are more hesitant and are trying to not say anything too controversial. So it's certainly a mix.
And you did mention the CFOs in the US are more cautious compared to CFOs here in the region. What about the rest of the world? You do speak to CFOs all around the world. How do you get a feel from them? And are your questions to them changing? Because I want your perspective as a journalist. Is it only your questions to them, or their feel or their way of answering the questions that's also changing?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting if you talk to CFOs who have business in the US.
Okay.
They are certainly very honest and straightforward when it comes to tariffs, but then they're also oftentimes hesitant to criticize the administration. So you certainly see this navigating amongst executives, because of course they also don't want to be called out by Trump.
Okay.
They don't want to be in a position of waking up and finding a negative post about themselves on Truth Social, where Trump often posts. So that's certainly interesting. There's a lot of hesitancy also amongst European companies.
Okay.
Many of them, of course, also heavily relying on doing business in the US, even though there's also some optimism that some money flows will come to Europe now that the US has lost its third AAA credit rating. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, I guess. And I think with Briefing, which tries to be a global newsletter and wants to cover global corporate finance trends, of course, is super interesting in this current environment to be having the opportunity to talk to CFOs all around the world, because independent of where you go, of course, there are certain headlines that dominate, including Trump, but then also there's certainly very different answers on how people think this will go and what do they do in response. So really opportunity is appreciated.
Nina, were you working as a journalist during Trump's first administration? And what has changed between then and now in the way that you cover, or maybe the news that you cover? What's different?
Yeah, I was, when Trump took on his first presidency, I was in London.
Okay.
I was with the Wall Street Journal, not with Bloomberg, but at the time, of course, there was also a lot of other things going on. The UK, for example, was just going through its Brexit from the European Union, and Trump was also in office. I think many of the things that we're seeing now, we also saw during the first administration, like tariffs, geopolitical tensions. Certainly, I think what has changed now is that, Trump has a majority in Congress now, has also support in the Supreme Court, and so I think what we are seeing now is certainly sort of an elevation of what we saw in the first administration, and I think the newsroom is probably even more on tenterhooks than it was during the first Trump administration.
What would be the most interesting moment in the past 110, maybe 120 days, I'd say, since President Trump took office? What has been the most interesting day in the newsroom for you, or for your work, whatever it is that you are working on at the time? What did you feel was, okay, now this is the most interesting day that I've had in the past 3 months?
I would certainly say April 2.
Of course, Liberation Day.
Yeah, Liberation Day, when the tariffs were announced, and then to see how the markets were reacting, how stocks were selling off, and basically all U.S. assets were selling off, which of course is a new situation, because usually it was one or the other, but never all of them at the same time. And interesting then to see, how are companies responding to it, how are CFOs responding, and then 2 weeks later, if not less, the Trump administration